The smell hit her first. Every species on Varath Station had a smell. The Thulan researchers smelled like wet stone after rain. The Chavari security team smelled like iron and something faintly burned. The Dravrath crate, newly arrived, still cold from transit, smelled like char and dark soil and something old, something that had no interest in being named. Nora Aldrich pulled her maintenance kit from the wall rack and clipped her scanner to her belt. 12 hours ahead of her, 43 systems to check. The biohabitat wing at night was quiet in a heavy way, not a peaceful one. The air recyclers hummed. The grow lights on the far side pulsed low. The things living in the habitat pods shifted and settled in their enclosures, and sometimes they made sounds that did not have human equivalents. She did not mind it. She had been doing this for 6 years. Dr. Orev had pulled her aside before the shift started. He was a careful man, four-armed, gray-skinned, the kind of researcher who measured his words the way other people measured chemicals. He told her a Dravrath hatchling had arrived on the afternoon transport, last survivor of a clutch, habitat destroyed in a methane field collapse on the eastern continent of Dravath Prime. He told her the crate was sealed and locked. He told her the hatchling had already injured 2 handlers during the transfer. He told her not to approach it, not to speak near it, not to do anything except log its temperature readings from the wall panel outside the crate room. Then he looked at her in that way Thulan scientists sometimes did, like they were deciding how much to say, and added that Dravrath hatchlings were apex predators, not theoretically, actually. On their home world, adult Dravrath had no natural enemies. The hatchling was small, but its instincts were complete from the moment it hatched. It did not know it was small. Nora told him she understood. He nodded and left. She started her rounds at the far end of the wing. Pressure seals on the ammonia habitat, nutrient flow in the deepwater tank, filtration cycling in the moss corridor. She worked steadily, checking each system against the log, marking what was normal and flagging 2 things that were not. Nothing serious. A slow filter and a temp calibration that had drifted 2 degrees. She fixed both and kept moving. She reached the Dravrath crate room at the halfway point of her route. She stood outside the door for a moment, then she did what she always did, she went in. The crate was in the center of the room, roughly 2 meters long, 1 meter tall, dark composite material with a mesh panel on the near side. The room smelled strongly of that char soil combination she had noticed from the corridor. The environmental regulators were keeping the temperature high. Dravrath hatchlings needed heat. She went to the wall panel and pulled the overnight readings. Temperature stable, hydration system functioning, no physical alerts. That was when she heard it. Not a hiss, not a snarl, something lower and more rhythmic, a clicking sound, soft and steady, coming from inside the crate. She had never heard it before and did not have a word for it. She looked up the Dravrath behavioral database on her wristcom while standing very still. The entry was short. Hatchlings used clicking as a locating sound, similar to the way some Earth animals used echolocation, but not for distance, for assessment, for deciding what something was. She looked at the crate. The hatchling was looking back at her. It was pressed against the mesh panel, copper eyes catching the low light of the room. Its scales were dark, nearly black, with a faint iridescent edge that only showed when it moved. It was small, roughly the size of a large cat, if a large cat had a heavy, angular head and a tail that made up half its body length. Its claws, she could see 4 on the near foot, were hooked and looked very clean. It was not making any aggressive sounds. It was just looking at her. Nora did not move. She was afraid. She knew the difference between the idea of something dangerous and the actual presence of it, and standing in a small room with a Dravrath hatchling pressed against the mesh watching her with those eyes was the actual presence of it. Her heart was doing what hearts did. Her breathing wanted to go shallow. She kept it slow, deep and slow. The clicking continued. She looked back at it and did not look away. After maybe 2 minutes, she did not check the time. The hatchling sat back, not retreating, just settling. It blinked once, the slow lateral blink that she would later learn meant it had finished its first assessment, and went back to watching her with the calm focus of something that had already decided she was not prey and was now trying to figure out what she was instead. That was when she noticed the crate. The lower left corner of the mesh panel had a gap, small, the width of 2 fingers. A transit latch had failed during transport and no one had flagged it in the handoff paperwork. The mesh was still in place. The hatchling had not pushed through it, but it could have. It had chosen not to. Nora stood very still for a long moment. Then the latch gave the rest of the way with a soft mechanical click, and the mesh panel swung open 6 centimeters. The hatchling looked at the gap, then it looked at her. It stepped out onto the floor. It did not rush, it did not posture. It walked across the room on careful, deliberate feet, stopped at her boots, and sat down. It looked up at her. Nora looked down at it. Neither of them moved for a long time. The first thing Nora did was nothing. That was not a small thing. Every nerve in her body had an opinion about the situation, and every opinion was loud. The hatchling was real, and it was close, and it was looking at her with those copper eyes like she was a problem it was still working out. Her instincts wanted her to back toward the door. She did not back toward the door. She breathed. She kept her arms loose at her sides. She did not look directly into its eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, because she had read enough about predator species to know that a long direct stare was a challenge, not a greeting. She let her gaze go soft and her posture go still, the way she had learned to go still in tight maintenance corridors when a pressure seal was failing and panic would not help. The hatchling sniffed the air in her direction, then it sniffed her boot. It moved around to the other boot and sniffed that too. It was methodical about it, the way it was methodical about everything, and it did not rush. She slowly opened the Dravrith behavioral database again on her wristcom and read while it investigated. The data was not long. Most of what had been recorded came from field observations of adult Dravrith, not hatchlings. What existed about hatchling behavior said this. In the first 72 hours after hatching, a Dravrith hatchling's brain was running a specific and irreversible process. It was looking for the first large, warm-bodied creature that did not flee from it. That creature became, the translation was approximate, a fixed point, a reference, something the hatchling's nervous system would use to calibrate threat assessment for the rest of its life. The imprint faded after the window closed. The hatchling would eventually be its own creature, independent and complete, but during the window it watched, it followed, it learned. She put the comm away. The hatchling had moved to her knee. It had its forepaws on her lower leg and was pulling itself up with the quiet efficiency of something that had decided her leg was climbable terrain. Its claws were sharp. She could feel the pressure through the thick fabric of her work pants, but it was not digging in. It was being precise. She did not stop it. It reached her hip, paused, reassessed, and then kept going. Up the side of her jacket, onto her shoulder. It was heavier than it looked, dense. She felt its tail wrap once around her upper arm for balance, loose and careful. Then it moved to her back, settled itself between her shoulder blades, and stopped. She felt it shift twice, adjusting, then it went still. It was on her back. A predator species that had injured 2 trained handlers was sitting on her back between her shoulder blades like it had been doing this for years. Nora stood in the middle of the crate room and took a slow breath. Then she picked up her maintenance kit and walked out of the room to finish her shift. She had 21 systems left to check and roughly 5 hours to do it. She walked the route the way she always walked it, steady pace, tools ready, attention on the panels and seals and flow readings, the hatchling rode. Every time she stopped and crouched to check a low panel, she felt it shift its weight to stay balanced. When she stood back up, it shifted again. It was good at this, unnervingly good, like it had a working understanding of her center of gravity from the first 30 seconds. She started talking to it quietly, not because she expected it to understand. The translation systems on the station were designed for species with developed language, not hatchlings, but because silence felt stranger than speaking. She explained what she was doing. She told it why the circulation filter in Section 9 needed to be pulled and cleaned every 40 days, and what happened to air quality if it was not. She told it the pressure differential on the ammonia habitat had been creeping up over the last week, and she was watching it. She told it that the grow lights in the moss corridor ran on a cycle, and that the current low pulse setting was for night simulation and the things living in there needed it. The hatchling clicked occasionally, short sounds evenly spaced. She started to think of them as punctuation. She reached the deepwater tank at the 2-hour mark and ran the full diagnostic. It took 12 minutes. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall panel. The hatchling adjusted without complaint, settling between her shoulders and the wall with its tail curled around her side, and watched the numbers run. Everything was fine. She logged it and moved on. At the 3-hour mark, she reached behind her back without thinking to adjust the hatchling's position. It had slid slightly to the left, and she could feel the imbalance. She moved it gently to the center. It pressed its snout briefly against the back of her hand, a quick, dry touch, and then let her reposition it. She stared at the wall panel in front of her for a moment. Then she logged the reading and kept working. By the time the 5th hour arrived and the end of her route came into sight, the hatchling had not moved from her back except to balance. It was awake. She could tell because it watched everything she did with the same focused attention it had given her in the crate room, alert, cataloging, quiet. She stopped at the last panel and ran the final check. Morning crew was 3 hours out. She needed to figure out what to do. She knew that. She knew she should have called it in the moment the mesh panel opened. She also knew that if she had called it in, someone else would have come running and the hatchling would have had a very different night. She logged the final reading and stood in the corridor. The hatchling clicked once, low and steady. She reached up and rested 2 fingers lightly on its foreleg. "I know," she said to no one in particular. "I know." Bren had been working overnight security on Varath Station for 9 years, and in that time he had seen things that did not fit into standard incident categories. A Thulan junior researcher sleepwalking into a restricted bay. A pair of Chivari engineers who had somehow managed to flood the secondary cargo corridor with mineral foam. A diplomat from a species he still could not correctly name who had gotten lost in the service tunnels for 11 hours and refused to be embarrassed about it. He thought he had a reasonable idea of the range of things that could happen on a quiet overnight shift. He was looking at his monitor now and revising that assumption. The automated alert had come in 40 minutes ago, low priority, no alarm tone, just a text flag. Crate seal breach, biohabitat wing, section 12. The thermal sensors had not triggered, which meant no aggression spike. The motion sensors had not triggered a chase pattern, so it had sat in his queue as a low-priority note while he finished a report on a coolant irregularity in the docking bay. When he finally pulled up the corridor feed, he sat very still for a moment. The biohabitat wing's night maintenance camera covered the central corridor. Nora Aldrich was in frame, crouched in front of a low panel, running what appeared to be a routine check on a filtration line. She was doing it the same way she always did, methodically, no wasted movement, logging as she went. On her back, between her shoulder blades, a Dravrath hatchling was riding. Bren leaned closer to the screen. He checked the crate room camera. The crate was open. The hatchling was not in it. He switched back to the corridor feed. The hatchling was watching Nora work with focused copper eyes, its tail wrapped loosely around her upper arm, its posture entirely relaxed. He pulled the hatchling's intake record. Dravrath hatchling, sole surviving specimen, arrived on the transit from Dravath Prime. Note from handling team at the departure station. Extreme caution required. Hatchling had already caused 2 injuries during transfer. Do not handle without protective equipment and sedation protocol on standby. He looked at the feed again. He could not file this under any category he had. He opened a channel to Dr. Orev. Orev answered after 2 chimes. His voice was careful in the way it always was, measured, not groggy, even at this hour. Bren told him there was a situation in the biohabitat wing that did not constitute an emergency, but that he felt required the researchers' direct attention. He described what he was seeing. There was a short silence on the other end. Then Orev said he was coming down. He arrived in the security observation corridor 9 minutes later, still pulling on his work coat. He stood next to Bren in front of the monitor and did not speak for a long time. On the feed, Nora had moved on from the filtration panel and was now walking the corridor toward the deepwater tank. The hatchling rode. It was alert, watching the environment, occasionally clicking in short bursts. "That is a contact bond posture," Orev said finally. Bren did not know what that meant. He said so. Orev was quiet for another moment, watching the feed. Dravrath hatchlings use a specific set of behaviors during the imprint window. The posture it is holding, dorsal position, tail contact, forward-facing orientation, is not a resting posture. It is a positioning behavior. The hatchling has placed itself at the highest point on her body where it can observe the widest field while remaining in physical contact. It is a behavior that field researchers have only ever documented between Dravrath hatchlings and their own kind. Bren looked at the screen. The hatchling was watching Nora pull a diagnostic tool from her kit with the attentive calm of something that had decided it was responsible for monitoring the situation. "Should I go in?" Bren asked. Standard question, he already suspected the answer. No, Orev did not hesitate. Movement by a stranger would read as a threat. The hatchling is calm. If we send someone in, we change that. They watched together in silence for a while. Nora crouched at a low panel. The hatchling adjusted. She stood. It adjusted again. She reached behind her back with one hand, briefly, absent-mindedly, and repositioned it 2 centimeters to the left. The hatchling allowed this. It pressed its snout to the back of her hand for a moment, then settled. Orev made a quiet sound that Bren had learned, after years of working alongside Thulan researchers, was the sound they made when something did not match their existing models. "What?" Bren asked. "That gesture, the contact with her hand." Orev pulled out his own recorder and began making notes. "Dravrath hatchlings do not make that gesture with non-Dravrath. In 11 years of research, I have not seen footage of it being made with another species at all." He paused. "She is not reacting to it. She probably does not know what it means." "No," Orev said, "but she is not pulling away either. She is just continuing to work." They watched her finish the deepwater diagnostic and move on. The hatchling rode the whole way. The corridor was quiet. The station hummed around them. After a while, Orev said, almost to himself, "I told her to observe it from outside the room." Bren decided not to comment on that. "Pull every sensor reading from the past 4 hours," Orev said. "I want the full thermal log, the audio capture, and the motion data, all of it." Bren started pulling the files. Orev kept watching the screen. On the feed, Nora had reached the last section of her route. The hatchling had not moved from her back. "Do not file an incident report yet," Orev said. "I am going down there myself." Nora heard the door at the far end of the corridor open. The hatchling heard it too. She felt it lift its head behind her, felt the small shift in weight as it oriented. She turned slowly, keeping her movements easy. Dr. Orev was walking toward her along the maintenance corridor, alone, no protective gear. He was moving at a careful, measured pace, the kind of pace that said he knew exactly what was in the room and was choosing his steps accordingly. The hatchling watched him. Nora watched it watch him. It did not click. It did not lower its head and extend its neck, which she had read was a warning display in the behavioral notes. It assessed him for about 4 seconds and then looked away, back to the corridor ahead of her. It had categorized him and moved on, not interesting, not a threat, not worth further attention. Orev stopped about 2 meters away. He had a recorder in his upper left hand. His expression was difficult to read. Thulan faces were quieter than human ones, but she knew him well enough after 2 years on the same wing to see that he was very focused. "I would like to know," he said, keeping his voice low and even, "what happened." Nora told him. She gave him the full account, the cracked latch, the open panel, the hatchling stepping out, the way it had sat at her boots and waited. She told him she had made the call not to alert anyone in the moment and that she understood if that was a problem. She told him the truth about why, that she had looked at it and it had not been doing anything except looking back, and that running something frightened into a corner never helped it. Orev listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. When the panel opened, he said, "Were you afraid?" "Yes." "What did you do?" "Kept breathing, kept still, didn't look directly at it for too long." "Where did you learn that?" She thought about it. Long shifts in bad situations. When a pressure seal is failing and you're the only one in the corridor, fear doesn't help the seal. You do what you can do and you don't add panic to the problem. She paused. Things that can kill you don't always mean to. Sometimes they just need to see what you do next. Orev made a note. He looked at the hatchling. It was resting now, or something close to it. Its weight had settled heavier on her back, its breathing slower, still awake. Its eyes still tracked the room, but the high alertness of earlier in the night had dropped a level. "It made a contact gesture with your hand earlier," Orev said. "Did you notice? When I repositioned it, it touched my hand." That gesture is made between Dravrith individuals who are in a bond relationship. I have not found a single recorded instance of it being made to another species in all the documentation we have. He paused, looking at his recorder. What you may not know is that the Dravrith word for the creature that receives that gesture has no exact translation. The closest approximation is something like a witness, a trusted observer. Nora said nothing. For Dravrith, Orev continued, a witness is not a protector or an owner. It is a creature whose perception they trust, whose presence in the world they consider accurate. He lowered the recorder slightly. It has decided that you perceive it correctly. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the wing, one of the habitat filters cycled. "I'd like to ask you something," Nora said. He nodded. "Is it going to be okay, the hatchling?" Orev considered this carefully. If it survives the imprint window without trauma and is transferred to a conservation habitat with appropriate conditions, the probability of a stable life is reasonable. The Dravrith Conservancy has been working with the remaining breeding population for 12 years. They know what they are doing. He paused. The situation tonight is unusual. A feral hatchling in an imprint bond with a member of another species is unprecedented in our records. What it means for its long-term behavioral development is not fully known. "But it chose this," Nora said. "It walked out of the crate on its own, and it chose where to sit." "Yes," Orev said, "it did." "Then that's where we start." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to request your participation in a formal study, logged, compensated, entirely voluntary. The next 68 hours, the remainder of the imprint window documented properly, your interactions, its responses, everything." He paused. "This hatchling is possibly the last of a functional breeding line from its region. What it does and why it does it matters for the entire conservation effort, and it has chosen you as its reference point. That means you are currently the most important variable in the study." Nora looked at the wall for a moment, then she looked back at him. "Okay," she said. "Your shift ends in 2 hours." "I know. You do not have to stay." She reached back with one hand and rested 2 fingers lightly on the hatchling's foreleg. It clicked once, brief, low, and pressed down slightly against her fingers. "I'll stay," she said. Orev turned on his recorder and began to document. 3 weeks after the night shift, the footage was everywhere. Bren had flagged the corridor recordings as research documentation, which meant they entered the station's internal archive rather than the public channel. But internal archives on a station with 400 staff across 11 species were not exactly sealed. Someone pulled a clip, someone sent it. Within 4 days, it had crossed 3 relay stations and landed in the Galactic Cooperative's general research feed, where it spread in the way that strange and unclassifiable things spread, quietly at first, and then all at once. The clip was 40 seconds long. It showed a human walking a maintenance corridor with a Dravrith hatchling on her back. That was all. 40 seconds of Nora checking a pressure panel, the hatchling riding between her shoulders, the 2 of them moving through the corridor in the kind of easy rhythm that looked, to anyone watching, like it had always been this way. The reactions split along lines that were mostly predictable. Several Thulan academic groups released statements noting the behavioral anomaly and requesting access to Dr. Orev's full documentation. Two Chivari defense councils flagged the footage as requiring review. A predator apex species in uncontrolled contact with a civilian was, in their assessment, an incident, regardless of how it appeared. A small number of species who had existing knowledge of Dravrath cultural tradition sent much quieter messages directly to Orev, asking specific and careful questions about the gesture they had seen the hatchling make. On the station itself, the split was sharper. Dasev was Orev's junior researcher, young, efficient, and constitutionally skeptical about anything that could not be explained by a clear mechanism. He had reviewed the behavioral data 3 times and was not satisfied with any of the conclusions he was drawing. On the 14th day after the incident, he found Nora in the mid-wing corridor, the hatchling on her back, larger now, noticeably, roughly the size of a medium dog, its scales beginning to develop the faint secondary coloring that adult Dravrath carried, and he asked her directly. "What did it feel like," he said, "when it chose you instead of attacking?" Nora ran her scanner along the wall panel before answering. "Responsibility," she said. Dasev waited. She did not add anything. He was quiet for a moment and then walked away, which was the closest he came to being at a loss. Nora's sister Myra worked the station's agricultural deck. She had heard about the footage the same way everyone else had. Station gossip traveled at a speed that made the internal mail system seem slow, but she waited until the 3rd week to come down to the biohabitat wing. She stood in the observation room doorway and watched Nora move through the enclosure space with the hatchling, who was now large enough that its presence on her back pulled her posture slightly rearward. It was still riding. It still preferred that position above any other. Myra watched for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "You've always been the one who stays still when everything else runs." Nora looked over at her. "Remember when Dad's generator failed during the winter storm?" Myra said. "You were 16. The power cut and the temperature dropped, and everyone else was moving and making noise, and you just sat down and started working through it." "I was just thinking." "You were just staying still," Myra said. "That's not the same thing as nothing." The hatchling turned its head toward Myra, assessed her, looked away. Myra took that as a moderate success and left. The message from the Dravrath Conservancy arrived on the 21st day, addressed to Orev's research account, but flagged specifically for the attention of the translation was precise, the human in the documentation, not the research team, the human. Orev brought it to Nora in the observation room. He handed her his comm and let her read it. She read it twice. The Conservancy was the organization that had been working with the remaining Dravrath breeding population for over a decade. It was run by a small team of elder Dravrath who had survived the habitat collapses that had reduced their species to a fraction of its original numbers. They were formal correspondents. Every sentence was considered. They had seen the footage. They had recognized the gesture the hatchling made on the first night. They wanted to speak with Nora directly, not with the research team, not with station management, with her. They gave a time, 48 hours from the message's arrival. They said they would explain their reasons in the conversation itself. They said this was not a formal inquiry and there was no obligation to agree. Orev watched her read it. When she lowered the comm, he said, "You do not have to respond." "I know. The request is unusual. The Conservancy does not typically reach out to individuals outside their own species, except through official diplomatic channels." "I know." The hatchling shifted on her back. She reached up and steadied it without looking, the way she had been doing for 3 weeks without thinking about it. "What do they want to tell me?" she asked. "I have some idea," Orev said. "I would rather you hear it from them." She looked at the time on the wall display, 47 hours, 20 minutes. "Okay," she said, "I'll be there." The communication hall was cold the way formal rooms were always cold on Varath Station, not unpleasant, just deliberate. The long-range relay terminal took up most of the far wall, a curved panel of translation processors and signal hardware that hummed at a frequency Nora could feel in her back teeth. She had not brought the hatchling. Orev had advised against it, and she had agreed. The relay signal had harmonics that were uncomfortable for Dravrith hearing, and the hatchling was too old now to be carried into strange environments without risk of a stress response. It was in the observation room with Dasev, who had agreed with visible reluctance to watch it for the duration of the call. Two faces appeared on the relay screen. Dravrith elders, old enough that their scales had gone grey at the edges, the black faded to something closer to dark charcoal. Their eyes were the same copper as the hatchlings. They sat with a stillness that felt practiced over a very long time. The translation system rendered their speech into a careful, precise version of the cooperative's common language. There was a slight delay between what Nora could hear of their actual voices, a low harmonic sound, layered and complex, and the words that appeared in her earpiece. The elder on the left spoke first. They thanked her for accepting the call. They said they would not take much of her time. They had seen the documentation. They had seen the gesture the hatchling made. They wanted to explain what it meant in full because they felt she deserved to understand what she had been given. She listened. Among Dravrith, they told her, the creature that received the contact bond gesture was called, in the oldest form of their language, something that translated roughly as a witness. Not a guardian, not an owner, not a caretaker, a witness. When a Dravrith elder died, the witness was called upon to speak, to say what was true about the creature's life, what it had done, what it had been. The witness's account was the account that was kept. The hatchling had no history yet. It had no elder to return to, but it had done what Dravrith did. It had looked at the world in the first hours of its life and chosen the creature it believed would see it honestly, the creature whose perception it trusted. It had chosen Nora. The elder on the right spoke then. They said, the Conservancy had wondered for a long time about humans, the species that had arrived at the cooperative already carrying old damage, already shaped by things that should have broken them and not broken. They had not known what to make of that. They had not had language for it. Now, perhaps, they understood a little better. They asked, would she honor it? Nora sat in the cold, formal room with the relay humming in her back teeth and looked at two old Dravrith elders on a screen across the light years. Yes, she said, no pause. The elders were quiet for a moment. Then the one on the left made a sound that the translation system did not render into words. The system flagged it as a cultural marker with no common language equivalent. In her earpiece, all she heard was the tone of it, low, resonant, something that her body read as significant before her mind caught up. The call ended. She sat in the communication hall alone for a few minutes. Then she went back to the biohabitat wing. The hatchling was being prepared for transfer. The conservation habitat had been confirmed, a Planet 2 relay jumps from the station, the right atmospheric composition, the right temperature range, an existing small population of Dravrith from a different regional line. The transport was docked. The departure was in 6 hours. Dasev was finishing the transfer documentation when she came in. He handed her the com without comment, which was the most considerate thing he had done in 3 weeks. She reviewed the paperwork and signed where she needed to sign. The hatchling was in a new crate, proper, large, padded, with a heating element and a hydration system and a mesh panel it could see through. It was lying down. It was large enough now that it nearly filled the length of the crate. In 6 months, it would be large enough that no one would look at it and think of the word small. Orev found her standing in front of the crate. He stood next to her, hands folded, and said, "It does not need you anymore. Behaviorally, it is stable, independent. The imprint window closed 4 days ago." "I know," she said. "This is a good outcome for the species, for the conservation effort." "I know." They stood there together. The hatchling raised its head and looked at her, not at Orev, at her, those copper eyes unchanged from the first night. The same assessment, the same focused calm. 3 weeks of maintenance rounds and midnight hours and quiet conversations in empty corridors, and it looked at her the same way it had looked at her when she was just a pair of boots it had decided to sit at. She crouched down in front of the crate, put her hand flat against the mesh. The hatchling pressed its snout to the other side of her palm. One click, soft, steady. She stayed there until she heard the transport bay doors begin to close. She stood, stepped back, and let the team do their work. Orev wrote his final report that night. At the end, after all the data and the documentation and the behavioral analysis, he added a personal note he marked as non-clinical. He wrote that he did not believe the hatchling had chosen Nora because she was fearless. He believed it had chosen her because she was afraid and stayed anyway, and that in 11 years of research across dozens of species, he had never seen another creature do that so quietly and so consistently as humans did. He flagged the note, read it once more, and left it in.